Hey there, how there, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond welcoming you to yet another Cutter Top 10 NHL video as I'm rocking the Leafs Ace jersey today. And we are going to be taking a look at the top 10, sorry, actually the top 15 NHL Stanley Cup overtime goals. The Stanley Cup finals are happening. We have Vegas versus Carolina. Congratulations to those guys and all that. So we got ourselves some interesting goals to talk about and all that. So, yeah, as I do my stats and all that, I realized that I had completely goofed up on a lot of things because when I did the original list, I forgot one, and then when I did the top 10 NHL upsets, it reminded me, there's one that's supposed should be on this list that isn't. Why? I don't know. So anyway, yeah, I've made the changes and all that. Now, not all 15 goals are Stanley Cup winning goals in overtime. There are some that won games in overtime, but it didn't mean anything in the finals yet. All right, so of course I do the kind of spare fingers. Here we go. Number 15 is Marc Richard, 1953 against Boston. Actually, I think that's not right. I think it's Elmer Locke, 1953 against Boston. I just realized that. But anyway, 1953, we're going really old school on this one. The Bruins were taking on the Habs in the Stanley Cup Finals, and then Elmer Locke found the puck from Richard and scored a key goal and all that. And that won the cup in 1953 for the Bruin, for the Habs, because their hater was the Bruiners. Number 14 is Rene Robert in Game 3 of the Stanley Cup Finals in 1975. Buffalo were a tough, scrappy team. In 1970, they came into the league as an expansion team, and then 5 years later, they were going to the Stanley Cup. Rene Robert doing a lot of things right and all that. So in game 3, with the Flyers up 2-0, they went to the Buffalo Auditorium, which unfortunately was undersized and had no air conditioning. So basically, there was fog on the ice. They had to dissipate it many times. Jim Lawrence, Kitchener, former Kitchener Ranger, high stick the bat. That was in the stick. That was in the thing. However, the game was tied 4-4 in overtime when Rene Robert scored a key shot. Unfortunately, there was the fog, and Bernie Perron could not see through the fog. Robert scored the winning goal and got the Sabres to within a game of the Flyers. But unfortunately, the Flyers won in 6. Number 13 is Alex Burrows 2011. Again, this goal did not win a Stanley Cup final, but 2011 was huge. The Canucks in game 1 won with like 14 seconds left. It was huge. And then game 2 was a dogfight, which saw the game 1-1 going to overtime. And then just after the overtime started, um, the puck went to Alex Burrows. He circled around the net, fooling Tim Thomas with the wraparound, and scored to make it 2-1 for the Canucks. So the Canucks had split. Uh, well, they were up 2-0 on the Bruins, and everyone thought the Canucks were going to win the Stanley Cup. Unfortunately, Boston won all their home games, so did Vancouver till game 7. And in game 7, the Bruins shocked the Canucks 4-0, and the whole city got mad, so they decided to riot. Number 12 is Pete Babando, 1950. I know it's a cup winning goal, and I know there's a few non-cup winning goals above it. But Pete Babando's was kind of awkward and all that. 1950, the Red Wings took on the Rangers in the Stanley Cup Finals. Unfortunately, though, the Rangers were actually booted from their arena because old Madison Square Garden, not the one they play in now, but the old MSG in 1950 had the circus in town. Unfortunately, it would kick the Rangers out of the arena and all that. They didn't have the spare floor as the new one does. So anyway, the circus came in. The Rangers had to play the first 2 games in Toronto in the Stanley Cup Finals, and then all the rest of the games were in Detroit. So the Rangers didn't really have home ice advantage, if you will. Game 7 went to double overtime. Bones Raleigh actually had a chance to score a goal, but he freaking hit the post, and then people had no double overtime scored. Detroit won the Stanley Cup, and the Rangers couldn't believe it. They just couldn't win. But speaking of the Rangers, something in the positive, and that's number 11, is Brian Hextall. So Brian Hextall is, for 1940, the Rangers were back in the Stanley Cup Finals against the Leafs. It almost always happened. Remember, in 1933, Bill Cook scored an overtime cup-winning goal against the Leafs. In 1940, Brian Hextall did the same thing. Being the Leafs and the Rangers would win the Stanley Cup, they burned the mortgage of the garden in the bowl of the cup because they now had paid off the mortgage with their Stanley Cup win. Little did we know that for 54 years, the Rangers would win nothing. They said that was a curse, and also Red Dunden's curse, and the Rangers were snakebit in the final. They were always snakebit in the final. So yeah, that's what happened. Brian Hextall actually went to bed almost every Stanley Cup final smiling that his cup winning goal was the last Rangers cup winning goal in history. Number 10 is Igor Larionov in 2002. Red Wings would play Carolina Game 1, saw Ron Francis win in overtime, then Detroit won Game 2. Then we head down to North Carolina for Game 3, and it went long and long and long. It went to triple overtime, and then Igor Larionov became the oldest player in Stanley Cup Finals history to score a goal and an overtime win at that. When he somehow got the puck off of Archer Serbe, and with 5:25 left in the third overtime, Larionov scored. Red Wings won Game 3 and then won the next two to win the Stanley Cup. Number 9 is Johnny LeClair, doing it twice in 93. So the 93 Habs were massive and all that. They were expected to lose to the Nordiques in the first round of the playoffs. They were down 2-0. Andre Red Light Rasico almost came in net for the Habs, but Jacques Demers kept Waugh in. And Waugh paid his coach's loyalty by winning 4 straight games. They won Game 6 thanks to a Paul DiPietro hat trick. And then they took on Buffalo, swept them, and then took care of the Islanders in 5. So now they were taking on those pesky LA Kings, who had Wayne Gretzky, Gary Curry, and a few other players, and of course pissed off me personally because they beat the Leafs. So the Kings would take on the Habs. Kings were up 1-0, and then Game 2 happened. We'll talk about that in the next entry. But anyway, in Games 3 and 4 in Los Angeles, there were a few things. One game had Mark Hardy hit a Canadian. I think it was Mike Keane so brutally that the glass actually broke off. And there was the other game in which Waugh gave Thomas Sandstrom a big wink. But one thing's for sure, those two games were intertwined by overtime goals by John LeClair, who scored one goal while scrambling, and the puck went off of King, and then he found it in the net. And one goal that he beat Kelly Rudy with a massive deke and scored. Sure, Leon Draisaitl scored 2 overtime goals in last year's Stanley Cup playoffs. Stanley Cup Finals, but John LeClair was one of the first. And who knew that John LeClair would be good after he left Montreal? Number 8 is Eric Desjardins. So Desjardins was a star player for the Montreal Canadiens. Good defenseman. The 93 Cup run, he was good. And then came Game 2. Kings were about to go up 2-0, and then Jacques Demers kind of saw Marty McSorley have an illegal stick. So they measured McSorley's stick, which was an illegal curve. So McSorley and the stick would be in the box for 2 minutes or less. And then, of course, the Habs scored. Desjardins scored his second of the game on the power play. And then a minute into overtime, LA had a chance, missed it, and then Desjardins had a shot but went over top of the net. But then there was a pass right back to Desjardins from the point. He scores. 3-2 Kings lose to the Habs, and the Habs split the first 2 games of the Stanley Cup Finals in 93. And of course, won the next three with two by John Leclerc in overtime. But Desjardins a hat trick in the Stanley Cup Finals by a defenseman. That's big. Number 7 is Jason Arnott. For me, Jason Arnott's goal was massive. It was a cup-winning goal. The 2000 Devils were pretty good, and then they fired Robbie Ftorek with 8 games left. Larry Robinson was not as good. He was 4-4 as coach. And anyway, the Devils went through the Leafs and the Flyers to make the Stanley Cup Finals. They were down 3-1 to the Flyers in that round. But yeah, Jason Arnott did his job. The Stars did win in triple overtime to force a game 6 back home. But then Jason Arnott on a perfect pass from Elias scored over Ed Belfour. And the Devils were the Stanley Cup champs. Larry Robinson got a cup, and Claude Lemieux, who recently passed away, got his 4th Stanley Cup and all that. Number 6 is Peter Klima of the Edmonton Oilers. So this is the highest scoring non-overtime goal in history. And Peter Klima scored that. Number 85, of course, the year I was born, and of course, the year Klima defected from the Czech Republic. Now, Klima actually almost screwed himself over because he demanded money, car, and something for his girlfriend, too, rather than come over to North America to play for Detroit. So he got what he wanted. He went to Detroit. They traded in Edmonton in the Jimmy Carson deal. And that also saw Joe Murphy head to Edmonton. Cleveland was a serviceable guy. Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals, Oilers took on the Bruins. First Stanley Cup for Edmonton without Gretzky. And then it went to triple overtime. Klima barely played. And the Oilers were running out of options, so they threw him on the ice in triple overtime. The game actually was delayed because of a power outage, but thankfully the Boston Garden, unlike 1988, didn't have any problems. So anyway, Peter Klima was a pretty amazing guy and all that. So he came out the bench in triple overtime, got a pass from McTavish. And Klima went up, beat Andy Moog, and in triple overtime he scored. That was actually the longest Cup final game in history by time. And actually beat a few others and all that. And one of them was number 5, Uwe Krupp, 1996. Uwe Krupp was a decent player for Buffalo, and then he went to Colorado, Quebec/Colorado. He actually had to be replaced after the first game because of a massive injury. He was given 8 months to recover, which meant he was basically done for. But Krupp rehabbed tirelessly, got back to the Avalanche near the end of the year, and actually did quite well. The Avalanche in '96, the year after they left Quebec for Colorado, were a powerful team. They were pretty good, but they got a massive piece of the puzzle when Patrick Waugh got booted from Montreal. After all, he gave up 9 goals to Detroit. Patrick Waugh was not lifted in time. Mario Tremblay was smug, and then Waugh said, "That's it, I'm done." They traded him to Colorado because, get them out of the conference. Montreal would fall in the first round after being up 2-0 to the Rangers. And then the Avalanche would actually learn things. But yeah, Colorado ended up doing well. They beat Detroit in the Stanley Cup semifinals. Claude Lemieux's hit on Chris Draper was terrible. And then in the final, Colorado swept through Florida, who were making a massive Cinderella run. Uwe Krupp was the icebreaker with the goal 0-0 in triple overtime. Krupp put up the goal, and the Avalanche won their first Stanley Cup. It was probably hard for Quebec City fans because, that was their cup in a sense. So yeah, Colorado did it. Claude Lemieux won his 3rd Stanley Cup. He won with Montreal in '86 and New Jersey in '95. Now he had a cup of Avalanche. Cool. Number 4 is Bob Nystrom, 1980. Bobby Nystrom was a pretty good player for the Islanders and all that. The Flyers were taking on the Islanders in the finals. The Flyers had a 35-game unbeaten streak in that season, 25 wins, 10 ties. Of course, regular season overtime would not come back till 1983, so the Flyers probably would have won a few games in those 10 and then probably lost a few games. So Bobby Nystrom doing his job. as per usual. The Islanders actually made a massive move as a franchise. In 1972, they were an expansion team in the NHL. In 1973, they had the number one pick. They took Dennis Potvin, although Montreal was willing to trade 5 players to the Islanders for Dennis Potvin, but the Islanders told him to, suck a puck. I don't know why I said that, but anyway. Anyway, Colorado did their job. Well, no, sorry, the Islanders did their job. They actually went bit by bit. 1975, they beat Pittsburgh in the Stanley Cup quarterfinals, being down 3-0, reverse swept them, and then took care of the Flyers and they were down 3-0 to the Flyers, forced a game 7, but lost. And then they shockingly lost to the Leafs and Rangers in upsets in 78, 79. So this was their year. Billy Smith, Brian Trottier, Mike Bossy, Clark Gillies, and were powerful. The Islanders would beat the Flyers in Game 6 in overtime on a goal from Tonelli to Nystrom, and Nystrom scored a key goal. One of the calls you hear is the CBC call, but that was not Danny Gallivan on the call. That was Jim Robson, who did the Vancouver Canucks games. But yeah, Jim Robson did the call. Dan Kelly did the call for CBS, and his was a little different. But Nystrom did score the Stanley Cup Finals winning goal. And did you also know that 1980 Game 6 was actually the last time network TV in the US had a game till the 1990 All-Star Game? So they had the USA Network, they had a few other, like Cablevision and all that, but they didn't broadcast any NHL games on ABC, NBC, or CBS, which was kind of sad, if you say the least. Number 3 is Brett Hall, 1999. Everyone knows about that Brett Hall controversial goal, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, Buffalo took on Dallas. Dominik Hasek was in the Stanley Cup Finals. He needed to be. Dallas, with Brett Hall a few years after leaving St. Louis, was doing pretty well. Buffalo did win Game 1 on a goal by Jason Woolley. The shot heard around the world. And the Sabres won Game 1. But then it went to Game 6 in Dallas. It went to triple overtime. Brett Hall won the game with the goal. Unfortunately, though, it was controversial because he had skated in the crease, which was illegal in the NHL circles. However, it was actually found out that the NHL, after too many goals were called out for skates in the crease, actually had a rule change and said that if you were in possession of the puck with the skate in the crease, that was fine. Of course, they didn't really send the memo out to all the teams, and that caused a lot of trouble and all that. Number 2 is Alec Martinez, 2014. The double overtime goal to end all double overtime goals. So the Kings would take on the Rangers in the 2014 finals. The Rangers went on a massive run. They took out the Habs despite Chris Kreider running into Carey Price. The Kings were not expected to do well. They were low ranked just like 2012. And then they went into Chicago for the conference finals, which, they were beaten badly in 2013 by the Hawks, with Patrick Kane ending that series. But Alec Martinez scored a goal from the point against Chicago in Game 7 in overtime to force them to the Stanley Cup Finals. People forget about that goal. Everyone knows about Martinez's double overtime goal, but frig, the overtime goal to sink Chicago to get to the Stanley Cup Finals was big enough. The Rangers were known for blowing 2-goal leads, and it showed in Games 1 and 2, losing in overtime. They did force a Game 5 back in LA, but Alec Martinez took a big shot over Henrik Lundqvist's shoulder and got the Kings to Stanley Cup and put the Rangers out of their misery. And number 1 is, well, come on. You really think number 1 was not going to be number 1? It is number 1 for a reason. It's Bobby Orr. Still the gold standard. So the 1970 Bruins had been through the ringer in a few ways. They actually lost Ted Green, one of their top defensemen, to a stick swing incident with Wayne Mackey. The Bruins did come back and did quite well for themselves. And then by 1970, they were in the Stanley Cup Finals against the St. Louis Blues. The NHL, in their wisdom, put all the original 6 teams in one division, and then the 6 expansion teams in the other. So that's what ended up happening. And the Rangers, the original 6 were in their own thing. Montreal did not make it. They didn't even make the playoffs. They were not top 4. So in 1970, the Bruins took over. They took on the Blues, who were back for a third straight Stanley Cup final. But just like 68 and 69, they couldn't win one game to save their lives. So anyway, the Bruins won. Bobby Orr scoring the overtime goal 40 seconds into overtime past Glenn Hall, and then his momentum was taken out by Noel Picard's stick, inadvertently, I guess. But that flying image will always be in Stanley Cup lore. Always. Anyway, Liam McGuire did a lot of things, saying there were 70 references to the number 4, which was Bobby Orr's number. I think someone beat him with 77, but doesn't matter. It doesn't. So anyway, that goal was the gold standard for Stanley Cup final overtime goals, and it should be. Really, it should. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond at Do.